The bell above the door jingled at exactly 6:47 in the morning, and Paisley Brooks didn't even need to look up to know a truck driver had just walked in. She'd worked the breakfast shift at Cedar Ridge Diner long enough to recognize footsteps, but these footsteps were different. Slower, uneven, like each step cost something. She looked up from the coffee pot and saw him. A young man stood just inside the doorway, gripping the frame like he needed it to stay upright. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, his boots were caked in dried mud, and there was a bruise forming under his left eye that he hadn't bothered to hide. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, maybe longer. "Can I get a table?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Frank, the diner's owner, came out from behind the counter before Paisley could answer. Frank had built this diner with his own hands 30 years ago, and he ran it the same way he ran everything else in his life. Careful, a little suspicious, and completely unwilling to be taken advantage of. "We're not a shelter, son," Frank said, not unkindly, but firmly. "You got money for food?" The stranger's jaw tightened. "Not right now, but if you let me sit, I promise I'll pay. I just need to find work today, and then—" "That's what they all say," muttered a trucker at the counter, not even turning around. A woman 2 booths down pulled her purse a little closer to her body, like the stranger might lunge for it. Nobody said it out loud, but the message was clear. He wasn't welcome here. "I understand," the young man said softly, and that surprised Paisley more than anything else. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or try to guilt anyone into helping him. He just nodded, like he'd expected this exact reaction, and turned toward the door. "Thank you for your time," he added, to no one in particular, and started walking out. Something about the way he said it stopped Paisley cold. Not the words, the tone. There was no bitterness in it, no self-pity, just quiet gratitude, even though nobody had given him anything to be grateful for. She'd been waitressing for 9 years. She'd seen every kind of person walk through that door. The exhausted, the rude, the genuinely dangerous, the ones just having a bad week. She'd learned to read people fast, because in a town this small, you couldn't afford to be wrong about who you let close. And every instinct she had told her this man wasn't lying. "Wait," she called out. He turned around, surprised. Paisley untied her apron, reached into the front pocket where she kept her tips from the morning, and pulled out everything she had. $43. It wasn't much. It was supposed to cover her half of the electric bill this week. But she folded the bills into his palm before she could talk herself out of it. "There's a bus stop 2 miles down Route 9, she said. "This should get you a ticket to Denver, and something to eat before you go." He stared at the money like he didn't understand what was happening. "I can't take this from you." "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." She said it simply, like it wasn't a big deal, even though her heart was pounding. "Everybody deserves one person who believes them, even if they're wrong to." Frank opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Even he wasn't cruel enough to argue with that. Paisley disappeared into the kitchen for a moment and came back with a paper bag. 2 biscuits, a sausage patty wrapped in foil, and an apple she'd been saving for her own lunch. She pressed it into his hands along with the money. "For the road," she said. The young man looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize her face. His eyes were tired but sharp underneath the exhaustion, the way someone looks when they're used to noticing everything around them. "My name is Logan," he said. "Logan Carter. I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me. But I promise you, I will not forget this, not for the rest of my life." "You don't have to promise anything," Paisley said, smiling. "Just get where you're going, safe." He nodded once, tucked the food and money into his jacket, and walked back out into the cold morning light. Paisley watched him through the window as he made his way down the road, favoring his left leg slightly, until he was just a shape in the distance, and then nothing at all. What she didn't notice What nobody in the diner noticed was the black SUV that had been parked across the street for the last 20 minutes, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see through. It pulled away from the curb the moment Logan disappeared around the bend, moving slow, deliberate, like it wasn't following him so much as making sure of something. Frank shook his head as he walked back to the register. "You're too soft, Paisley. One day that kindness is gonna cost you." "Maybe," she said, tying her apron back on. "But I'd rather be too soft than too scared to help somebody." She had no way of knowing that the dirty, exhausted stranger she'd just given her last $43 to was 28-year-old Logan Carter, one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the country, the head of an empire built across a dozen states, currently stranded, hunted, and completely cut off from everyone he trusted, after 3 of his own men had tried to have him finish 2 nights earlier. All he had left in the world was a paper bag of food, a bus ticket, and a promise he intended to keep. The gates of the estate rolled open before the SUV even came to a full stop, and by the time Logan stepped out, 3 men were already waiting on the front steps. Marcus, his head of security, didn't say a word. He just looked at Logan's torn jacket, the bruise under his eye, and the mud still dried into his boots, and his jaw tightened like he was holding back something he wanted to say for a long time. "You look like hell," Marcus finally said. "Feels about right," Logan replied. Inside, the house was quiet in the way only very expensive homes can be quiet. High ceilings, marble floors that didn't creak. Nobody spoke above a certain volume here, not out of fear, but out of habit. Logan had built this place to feel like control, and right now, control was the only thing keeping him standing. He'd used the emergency protocol only 3 people alive knew about, a phrase, a location, a signal buried inside an old radio frequency his grandfather had set up decades ago for exactly this kind of situation. It had taken Marcus's team 6 hours to find him standing at that bus stop on Route 9, waiting for a ticket he never got to use. "Talk to me," Marcus said, once Logan had changed out of his ruined clothes and sat down in the study. "What happened out there?" Logan rubbed a hand over his face. 3 of my own men, Dominic's crew. They pulled me out of the car 2 nights ago, drove me almost 4 hours out, and left me on the side of a road with nothing. No phone, no wallet, no idea where I was. They wanted you dead. They wanted me gone. Dead just made it permanent. Logan's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, but a kind of cold calculation. If they'd wanted a body, I wouldn't be sitting here. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. So it's a power play. They think if you disappear quietly, nobody comes looking, and Dominic slides right into your seat. That's exactly what they think. Logan finally allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Which means right now, as far as they know, I'm either dead or too broken to come back. That's useful. Let them believe it a little longer. This was who Logan Carter really was, underneath the boots and the torn jacket. A man who'd inherited an empire at 24 and had spent 4 years proving, over and over, that inheriting it and deserving it were 2 different things. He ran legitimate businesses across a dozen cities, hospitality groups and logistics companies that gave his family's operation the appearance of respectability, while the parts of the business he despised ran quietly underneath, managed by men like Dominic, who believed loyalty was just a word people used until it became inconvenient. Marcus called a meeting with the inner circle that evening. 5 people, the only ones who knew Logan was alive. They gathered in the study with maps and phone records and theories about who else might be involved, and Logan sat at the head of the table, half listening, nodding at the right moments. But his mind kept drifting somewhere else entirely. "You're not here," said Elena, his lawyer and one of the few people he trusted completely. She'd known him since he was 19. "Where'd you go?" "Nowhere," Logan said. Then, after a pause, "There was a woman at a diner out near the mountains. I walked in looking like garbage, and everyone in that place wanted me gone. She didn't." "She helped you?" "Gave me everything she had in her pocket. Food, money for a bus ticket." Logan shook his head slowly. "She didn't know who I was, had every reason to assume the worst, and she still did it." Elena studied him for a moment. "You want to send her something? A thank you? Money, maybe?" "No," Logan said it faster than he meant to. "If I send her money, it becomes a transaction. She'll think I'm just some guy paying off a debt, and that's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Logan didn't have a clean answer. He'd spent 4 years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Loyalty that came with a price tag. Friendship that evaporated the moment it stopped being useful. Even the people at this table, people he genuinely trusted, had things to gain from staying close to him. Paisley had nothing to gain. She didn't know his name meant anything. She'd looked at a stranger who could offer her nothing back and decided to help him anyway. "I want to know who she really is," Logan said finally. "Not the version of her that helped a stranger one morning because it felt right in the moment. I want to know if that's actually who she is, every day, when nobody's testing her." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about going back there?" "Not as myself. Not yet." "That's a risk, Logan. Dominic's people could still be watching the roads out that way if they're smart. You go wandering back into a small town." "I won't go back looking like I did yesterday." Logan was already thinking it through, piece by piece, the same way he approached every problem in his business. "Clean me up, different look. I'll go as a businessman scouting property, something ordinary enough that nobody asks questions." Elena studied him carefully. "This isn't about gratitude anymore, is it?" Logan didn't answer right away. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline was lit up against the night sky, cold and enormous, nothing like the quiet little diner 2 states away. But he kept picturing it anyway. The paper bag she'd packed, the way she'd said everybody deserves one person who believes them like it cost her nothing to mean it. "I don't know what it's about yet," he finally said. "That's exactly why I need to go back." The man who walked into Cedar Ridge Diner the following week bore no resemblance to the one Paisley had handed her last $43 to. His hair was cut short and neat, his jaw clean-shaven, and he wore a charcoal jacket that fit like it had been made for him specifically, because it had. He carried himself differently too, shoulders back, steps even, nothing like the man who'd once gripped the doorframe just to stay upright. He looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a businessman passing through, the kind who occasionally stopped in small towns while scouting property for one investment group or another. Paisley barely glanced up when the bell rang. "Sit anywhere you like."
"Menu's on the table." "Thank you," Logan said, and something in the shape of those 2 words almost gave him away. But Paisley was already halfway to another table, balancing 3 plates of pancakes, and she didn't catch it. He picked a booth near the window and ordered black coffee and a plate of eggs, and when Paisley came to check on him 10 minutes later, he was scrolling through something on his phone like any other traveler passing through on business. "You new to town?" she asked, refilling his cup without being asked. "Just visiting for a bit, looking at some property around here." He glanced up at her name tag. "Paisley. Nice name." "Thanks. Comes from my grandmother. She'd probably tell you I don't live up to it. She was a lot more graceful than me." Paisley laughed at her own joke, an easy, unguarded sound, and moved on to the next table without waiting for a response. Logan watched her work the room. She moved between tables like she'd memorized every regular's order, calling out to a farmer by name before he'd even sat down, teasing a trucker about the same joke he apparently made every single time he came in, and dropping to one knee to talk to a toddler who'd started crying 2 booths over. None of it looked performed, It looked like exactly who she was when nobody special was watching. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, he'd become something of a fixture, the quiet businessman in the corner booth who always ordered the same thing, tipped generously without making a show of it, and asked good questions when Paisley had a minute to talk. He learned that Cedar Ridge had once been a mining town, that Frank had inherited the diner from his own father, and that Paisley had grown up 3 streets over in a house that was, in her words, small enough to burn down with one bad Thanksgiving. "You ever think about leaving?" Logan asked one afternoon when the diner was slow and she'd finally taken a seat across from him for 5 minutes. "Sometimes," she shrugged, wrapping both hands around a mug of coffee. "But then I think about who'd take care of this place if I did. Frank's getting older. The regulars would probably riot if their booth got a new waitress who didn't know their order." "That's not really an answer." Paisley smiled, caught. "No, I guess it isn't. Truth is, I like it here. I like knowing people. Big cities always seemed like a place where you could disappear, and I never understood why anyone would want that." Logan turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, thinking about how different that sounded from the way he'd grown up, surrounded by people who wanted to be seen, who measured their worth by how many rooms noticed when they walked in. "What about you?" she asked. "What's actually bringing a businessman all the way out to a town most GPS systems still get wrong?" "Property," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "And I like small towns. They're honest in a way bigger places aren't." "Careful," Paisley said, standing up as a new group of customers walked in. "Say something like that enough times and Frank might try to talk you into investing in this place." She walked off to seat the new arrivals, and Logan sat there a moment longer, turning that conversation over in his mind. He hadn't told her a single true thing about himself, and yet he felt more like himself in that booth than he had in years of boardrooms and negotiations back in Chicago. That was what unsettled him. He'd spent his whole adult life reading people for weakness, calculating what they wanted before they said it out loud, because in his world, that instinct kept you alive. He'd expected to find something similar in Paisley eventually, a version of kindness with strings attached, a warmth that turned out to be strategy once you looked closely enough. He hadn't found it. Not after a week of watching. That evening, back at the small rented cabin outside town where he was staying under a name that wasn't his, Marcus called to check in. "Anything?" Marcus asked. "She treats a truck driver exactly the same way she treats me," Logan said. "Same warmth, same attention. I've watched her do it for 6 days straight, and there's no difference depending on who's in front of her." "You sound surprised." "I am surprised." Logan sat by the window, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains against the night sky. "I keep waiting for the moment it slips, where she's nicer to the customer who tips well, or colder to the one who's rude to her. It hasn't happened once." "Maybe she's just good at her job." "Maybe." Logan didn't sound convinced, not because he doubted her, but because he was starting to realize something that unsettled him more than any threat Dominic's crew could put together. "Or maybe I've just never met anyone who's kind because that's actually who they are, not because they want something back." Marcus was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "You're not just testing her anymore, are you?" Logan didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The friendship that had started as an experiment, a way to measure whether her kindness at the diner had been real or simply a moment of good luck for a desperate stranger, had quietly become something else entirely. And he wasn't ready yet to say out loud what that something else was. Logan had told himself he was only staying in Cedar Ridge a few more days, then a few more after that. By the second week, he'd stopped pretending there was a real deadline at all. He used the extra time the way he used everything else in his life, deliberately, watching for patterns. Except this time, he wasn't studying a rival's business or a competitor's weaknesses. He was studying a woman who had no idea she was being studied, and the more he watched, the less it felt like an investigation, and the more it felt like something he simply wanted to understand.
It started with a Saturday morning. Paisley wasn't at the diner, and when Logan asked Frank where she was, the old man barely looked up from the grill. "Animal shelter," Frank said. "She's there most Saturdays. Doesn't miss it unless she's sick." Logan drove the 15 minutes out to the small shelter on the edge of town, telling himself he was only curious, that there was nothing unusual about a man wanting to know how someone spent her day off. He parked across the street and watched through the chain-link fence as Paisley walked a limping older dog around the gravel yard, patient with every slow step, laughing when the dog stopped to sniff the same patch of grass for the third time in a row. She wasn't paid for this. Nobody was watching to give her credit. She did it because the dog needed someone to walk it slowly, and she had a Saturday morning free. Later that same week, he saw her again. Not by accident this time, but because he'd started paying closer attention to her schedule than he probably should have. She was in the parking lot of the grocery store, helping an elderly woman named Mrs. Hutchins load bags into the trunk of a car that looked older than Paisley herself. Logan watched from a distance as Paisley carried the heaviest bags without being asked, refused the $5 Mrs. Hutchins tried to press into her hand, and stayed an extra 10 minutes just to hear about the woman's grandchildren. None of it was for show. There was no audience except Logan, and Logan didn't count, because as far as Paisley knew, he was just a businessman she'd struck up a friendly acquaintance with over coffee. That night, back at the cabin, Logan sat with a glass of untouched whiskey and thought about the men he worked with in Chicago. Men who performed generosity at charity dinners where cameras were guaranteed to be present, who wrote checks to causes only after confirming their name would be printed somewhere.
He'd grown up believing that was simply how kindness worked in the world he lived in, a transaction dressed up to look like something purer. Paisley didn't know how to perform anything. She just was who she was, in a grocery store parking lot as much as she was behind the counter of the diner. He mentioned it to Elena during one of their weekly calls. "You've been out there a month," Elena said. There was something careful in her voice, the tone of a friend who suspected more than she was saying. "Marcus tells me you've pushed back 2 board meetings to stay. The business runs fine without me sitting in every meeting." "That's not the point, Logan, and you know it." A pause. "What is it about her exactly?" Logan considered the question longer than he expected to. "She helps a dog that can't walk right, and nobody's going to thank her for it. She carries an old woman's groceries and won't take money for it. She treats everyone in that diner the same, whether they can afford to tip her or not." He exhaled. "I've spent my whole life around people calculating what they can get out of every interaction. I don't think Paisley has ever once done that math in her life." "You're falling for her." "I'm learning something from her," Logan said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't entirely sure the two things were as different as he wanted them to be. Elena let the silence sit for a moment. "And what exactly do you plan to do with what you're learning?" That was the question Logan didn't have an answer for yet. He'd built his entire adult life around an inheritance he never asked for. An empire with one respectable hand, and one hand he preferred not to examine too closely. He'd told himself for years that this was simply the cost of protecting what his family had built, that legitimate businesses and difficult decisions could exist side by side as long as the ledger balanced out in the end. Watching Paisley made that math feel flimsier than it used to. She had nothing, a waitressing job, a small house 3 streets over, a life that most people in his old world would consider small and unremarkable. And yet she gave more of herself away in a single week than most people Logan knew gave away in years. She wasn't trying to build a legacy or prove anything to anyone. She simply couldn't walk past someone who needed help without doing something about it. Logan thought about Dominic, sitting somewhere right now believing his boss was dead or too broken to come back, quietly building alliances to take over an empire built on fear and leverage. He thought about the years he'd spent making sure people respected him because they were afraid not to, rather than because they trusted him.
He wanted something different. He hadn't let himself admit that fully until this week, watching a woman kneel in a gravel yard to walk a limping dog slower than it needed to walk, simply because the dog seemed to want the company. The following morning, he stopped by the diner earlier than usual. Paisley was behind the counter, hair pulled back, humming along to something on the radio while she filled ketchup bottles. "You're here early," she said, glancing up. "Couldn't sleep." Logan slid into his usual booth, thinking about something. "Dangerous habit." She poured his coffee without being asked, same as always. "What's on your mind?" Logan looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth he could give her without giving away everything. "I've been thinking about what I actually want to build with my life," he said finally. "I think I've been getting it wrong for a while." Paisley set the coffee pot down and studied him with more interest than the comment probably warranted. "That's a heavy thing to think about over eggs and toast." "Maybe," Logan said, "but I think it's about time I started." The sign went up on a Tuesday morning, taped crookedly to the diner's front window where every regular would see it the moment they walked in for breakfast. "Due to rising costs, we regret to inform our customers that Cedar Ridge Diner may be closing permanently within the coming weeks. Thank you for 30 wonderful years." Paisley read it twice before she fully understood what it said, and by the time she did, Frank was already sitting at the counter with his head in his hands, looking older than she'd ever seen him look. "Property taxes went up again," Frank said, not looking at her. "Supplier costs, too. I've been running the numbers for 2 months trying to make it work, and I just can't anymore, Paisley. I'm sorry." "There has to be something we can do. A loan or—" "I already tried the bank." Frank shook his head. "Told me I'm a bad risk at my age, with margins this thin. And they're not wrong. I've been keeping this place open on stubbornness for the last 3 years, if I'm honest with myself." Paisley felt something crack in her chest, the kind of ache that came from watching something permanent suddenly become temporary. This diner wasn't just a job to her. It was the booth where she'd celebrated her 21st birthday with the only 3 friends she had back then. It was where half the town came to grieve after a funeral, and half the town came to celebrate after a wedding. If Cedar Ridge Diner closed, something essential about the town itself would close along with it. She didn't cry in front of Frank, because crying wouldn't fix the number on his spreadsheet. But that night, alone in her small house, she let herself feel the full weight of it. Logan heard about it the next morning, the way everyone in town heard about it, through Mrs. Hutchins, who'd heard it from her nephew, who'd heard it from Frank himself while getting his truck's oil changed. By the time the story reached Logan, sitting in his usual booth, it had already traveled through half of Cedar Ridge. "You've heard then?" Paisley said quietly, refilling his coffee with less energy than usual. "Guess the whole town has by now." "I heard," Logan said carefully. "I'm sorry, Paisley. I know what this place means to you." "It's not just me. Frank's employed 6 people here for years. Half of them don't have anywhere else to go if this closes." She set the pot down harder than she meant to. "I keep thinking there has to be something, some way to save it, but I don't have that kind of money, and neither does anyone else around here." Logan said nothing for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table the way he did when he was working through something in his mind. He had exactly the kind of money this situation required, sitting in accounts scattered across a dozen legitimate holding companies. The math wasn't complicated. What was complicated was doing it in a way that didn't turn into the very thing he was trying to avoid. Buying his way into her gratitude, the same way he'd once considered simply sending her money to repay a debt. He made a phone call that evening. "I need you to set something up," he told Elena. "A property acquisition, through Harrow Hospitality, not through anything connected to my name directly." "The diner," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "The diner, full asking price, no negotiation, and I want the deal to look like a routine acquisition by an investment group interested in preserving small-town properties. Every employee stays. Frank stays on as a consultant if he wants it, or retires with a proper settlement if he doesn't. I don't want the name changed, the menu changed, or a single booth moved. That's not how acquisitions usually work, Logan. I don't care how they usually work. That's how this one works. Elena was quiet for a moment. You know she's going to find out eventually that some anonymous company bought the place.
Small towns don't stay curious for long before someone starts asking questions.
I know, Logan said. I'll deal with that when it comes. The paperwork moved quickly once Elena set it in motion, quicker than any deal Logan had pushed through in years, because for once he wasn't negotiating for leverage or squeezing out every possible advantage. He simply told his people to make it fair, make it fast, and make sure nobody working there lost anything in the process. 2 weeks later, Frank called an all-staff meeting before the breakfast shift, and Paisley walked in, expecting the worst. I got a call yesterday, Frank said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in months. Relief mixed with disbelief. A hospitality group out of Chicago bought the property. Full asking price. No haggling. He shook his head like he still didn't quite believe it himself. They're keeping every single one of you on staff, keeping the name, keeping the menu. They're even putting money into renovations, new roof, new kitchen equipment, the works.
Who? Paisley asked. Who would do that for a diner in the middle of nowhere?
Didn't give a name, just said they believed in preserving what the town already had, instead of replacing it with something new. Frank wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to hide it. Whoever they are, they saved this place, saved all our jobs. Paisley felt tears come to her own eyes, relief and confusion tangled together. She thought about every wealthy investor she'd ever heard of, the kind who bought up small businesses just to gut them and rebuild something shinier and less personal in their place. This wasn't that. Somebody had looked at Cedar Ridge Diner and decided it was worth keeping exactly as it was. That afternoon, Logan sat in his booth as usual, watching Paisley move between tables with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there in weeks. When she finally sat across from him for a few minutes, her eyes were still red at the edges.
Best news I've had in years, she said, smiling despite everything. Some anonymous investor saved the diner. Nobody knows who. Frank thinks it might be some rich person with a soft spot for small towns.
That sounds like a stroke of luck, Logan said, keeping his voice even.
It's more than luck, Paisley said, shaking her head. Whoever did this didn't have to. They could have bought this place and turned it into something else entirely. Instead, they saved exactly what we already had.
She looked at him for a moment, something thoughtful crossing her face.
Makes you believe there really are good people out there who don't need credit for doing the right thing.
Logan held her gaze and said nothing, though something in his chest tightened at the words, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wanted credit for absolutely nothing except the fact that it made her happy. The town decided to celebrate the diner's reopening with something bigger than a simple ribbon cutting. Word went around that the Mountain Charity Festival, an annual event Cedar Ridge had held every summer for as long as anyone could remember, would be dedicated this year to raising money for the diner's staff and the shelter Paisley volunteered at, in gratitude for whoever had saved the town's oldest gathering place. Main Street closed to traffic for the day. Folding tables lined both sides of the road, covered in raffle baskets and homemade pies, and a small stage went up near the old fountain for the local band that played every year, whether anyone requested them or not. Logan almost didn't come. Elena had suggested he stay away entirely, worried that too much visibility might draw the wrong kind of attention back to him after weeks of staying carefully under the radar. But when Harrow Hospitality was named as a sponsor of the renovated diner, and the town committee reached out asking if a representative might attend, Logan found himself agreeing before he'd fully thought it through. He arrived in the same charcoal jacket he'd worn most days in Cedar Ridge,
though today he'd left off the tie, blending into the crowd of townspeople in flannel and sundresses far more easily than he expected to.
"You actually came,"
Paisley said when she spotted him near the pie table, genuine surprise on her face.
"I thought businessmen only showed up for photo opportunities and ribbon cuttings."
"I'm told I'm representing the company that sponsored the renovations," Logan said. "Apparently, that requires actually being present."
"Well, since you're stuck here all day, you might as well make yourself useful."
She handed him an apron before he could protest.
"We need someone at the dunking booth, and Frank refuses to do it 2 years running because he says his knees can't take the cold water."
Logan found himself spending the next several hours doing things he hadn't done in years, if he'd ever done them at all. Manning a dunking booth while children lined up to try their luck, helping an elderly couple set up a table selling handmade quilts, carrying crates of lemonade from a delivery truck to the festival grounds because the volunteer who was supposed to do it had twisted her ankle that morning. Nobody here knew who he really was. Nobody treated him with the careful, calculated respect people back in Chicago gave him. Respect that always came with an undercurrent of fear or ambition underneath it. Here, he was just the quiet businessman from the diner, occasionally teased by children for how badly he threw a baseball at the dunking booth target, occasionally scolded by an older woman for stacking the lemonade crates the wrong way. He liked it more than he expected to. Paisley found him again in the late afternoon, taking a break near the fountain with a paper cup of lemonade in hand. She dropped down onto the bench beside him, exhausted in the particular way that comes from a day spent doing things for other people.
"You've been busy,"
she said, nodding toward his damp shirt, evidence of a dunking booth well used.
"Didn't expect a man in a jacket that expensive to get thrown in cold water 11 times by a bunch of 10-year-olds.
12 times, Logan corrected. I was counting. Paisley laughed, and it was an easy, unguarded sound, the same one he'd heard from across the diner dozens of times now, except this time it felt like it belonged to him a little more than it had before.
"Can I ask you something?" she said, turning serious for a moment. "You could have sent flowers or a check or nothing at all today. Instead, you spent your whole afternoon getting dunked in cold water and hauling lemonade crates. Why?"
Logan considered the question carefully. "I think I've spent most of my life around people who show up when it benefits them and disappear the moment it doesn't. I wanted to see what it felt like to just be somewhere because it mattered, not because there was something in it for me."
"And? How does it feel?"
"Better than I expected," Logan admitted. "Better than most rooms I've been in that were supposed to matter a lot more than this one." Paisley studied him for a long moment, something warm and curious in her expression.
"You know, when you first showed up at the diner a month ago, I thought you were just another suit passing through. The kind who orders black coffee and doesn't tip well enough to justify the trouble."
"Harsh."
"I'm not finished," she smiled. "But you kept coming back, and you started asking questions like you actually wanted to know the answers, not just to be polite. And now here you are, soaking wet, covered in lemonade, helping an old woman fold quilts for 2 hours because she asked nicely." She shook her head.
"You're not what I expected, Logan Carter." Something about hearing his real name from her mouth, spoken with such simple warmth, made Logan's chest tighten in a way he wasn't fully prepared for. She had no idea how much that name actually meant, how many people either feared it or wanted something from the man who carried it. To Paisley, it was just the name of a friend who'd shown up to help fold quilts. "You're not what I expected either," he said quietly.
"What did you expect?"
"Someone whose kindness would eventually run out, or turn out to have a catch to it." Logan looked out at the festival crowd, at Frank laughing with a group of regulars near the diner's newly painted sign, at children chasing each other around the fountain. "I've been waiting a month for the moment it would. It hasn't come." Paisley was quiet for a moment, watching him with something unreadable in her eyes.
"Maybe that's because there isn't one,"
she said simply.
"Some people are just kind because it's easier than not being. I never understood people who treat it like some kind of strategy."
Logan didn't answer that, mostly because he wasn't sure how to explain, without giving everything away, just how rare that kind of simplicity had become in the world he came from. Instead, he sat beside her as the afternoon light softened over Cedar Ridge and let himself feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like exactly where he was supposed to be. The invitation came on a Thursday, delivered the old-fashioned way through a phone call rather than a text message. "I want you to see something I've been working on," Logan said. "Charitable projects the company's launched recently. I think you'd like to see where some of it started." "You want me to fly to Chicago?" Paisley said, half laughing at the idea. "Logan, I've never even been on a plane." "There's a first time for everything. I'll handle the details. You just need to show up." She agreed before she'd fully thought through what it meant, packing a single bag 2 nights later with the nervous excitement of someone about to see a part of the world she'd only ever imagined from a small booth in a diner. A car picked her up from the tiny regional airport outside Cedar Ridge, and by the time she landed in Chicago, another car was waiting to take her straight to the headquarters of Harrow Hospitality, the company that had quietly bought and saved her diner. The building rose taller than anything Paisley had ever stood beneath, glass and steel catching the afternoon light in a way that made her feel very small and very far from home. Logan met her in the lobby, wearing a suit sharper than anything she'd seen him in back in Cedar Ridge, and for a moment, she almost didn't recognize him. "This is where you actually work," she said, looking up at the ceiling that stretched 3 stories above them. "I thought you were just some guy scouting property." "I own the company," Logan admitted. "I probably should have mentioned the scale of it sooner." "You think?" Paisley laughed, though there was something uncertain underneath it now, a small crack of realization that the man she'd befriended over black coffee was clearly a much bigger figure than he'd let on. He gave her the tour himself, walking her through floors dedicated to the charitable arm of the company, community grants for small-town restaurants, scholarship programs for kids in towns exactly like Cedar Ridge, a wall of photographs showing diners and shops across half a dozen states that Harrow Hospitality had quietly saved from closing over the last several years, always keeping the original owners, always keeping the original names. Paisley stopped in front of one particular section of the wall, a series of photographs documenting the diner's renovation. There were before and after shots of the kitchen, the new roof going up, Frank shaking hands with someone whose face was cropped out of every image.
And then, near the bottom corner, a photograph she almost missed. A grainy still, clearly pulled from an old security camera, time-stamped from over a month ago. A young man standing at a bus stop on Route 9, torn jacket, bruised eye, gripping a paper bag of food. Paisley's breath caught in her throat. She looked closer, comparing the tired, dirty face in the photograph to the man standing beside her now in an expensive suit, and the resemblance she'd almost missed suddenly became impossible to ignore. Same jaw, same eyes, tired in the picture but unmistakably his. "That's not," she started, then stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Logan, is that you?" He didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "That's you," she said again, louder this time, stepping back from him like the ground had shifted under her feet. "The stranger at the diner, the one everybody wanted to throw out, that was you." "Yes," Logan said quietly. "That was me." Paisley's mind raced backward through the last month, every conversation, every coffee refill, every afternoon spent talking about nothing and everything, all of it recontextualized in an instant. "You knew," she said. "This whole time you knew who I was, and you let me believe you were just some businessman passing through." "I did." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended, hurt bleeding through the anger. "Why would you do that? Why not just tell me from the start?" Logan led her to a quiet office nearby, away from the open floor where employees moved between meetings, and once the door closed behind them, he finally let himself explain everything he'd been carrying for weeks. "3 men in my own organization tried to have me finished," he said. "Left me on the side of a road with nothing, hoping I'd either die out there or disappear quietly enough that nobody would ask questions. I walked for hours before I found that diner. Everyone there looked at me like I was exactly what I looked like.
A threat, a liar, someone trying to scam a free meal.
"Except me," Paisley said quietly.
"Except you." Logan met her eyes. "You gave me the last money in your pocket, packed food for a stranger who could offer you nothing back. I've spent my whole life around people who calculate exactly what they'll get before they give anything at all, and you didn't hesitate for a second."
"So you came back to test me,"
Paisley said, understanding dawning slowly, painfully.
"The businessman act, the coffee, all of it. You were just seeing if I'd turn out to be someone else once you got close enough."
"At first," Logan admitted. "I wanted to know if what you did that morning was really who you are, or just a moment of luck for a desperate man." He paused. It didn't take long to realize it wasn't a test anymore. "Somewhere in the last month, I stopped watching you to learn something and started just wanting to be near you." Paisley crossed her arms, still processing, still hurt, but listening.
"You could have told me the truth weeks ago, once you knew I wasn't going to change."
"I know." Logan's voice was steady, without excuses buried in it. "I was afraid that once you knew who I really was and what my family's business actually involves, you'd look at me the way everyone in that diner looked at me the first morning. Like a threat, like something to be careful of."
"And now?"
"Now I'd rather you be angry at the truth than comfortable with a lie," Logan said. "You deserve to know exactly who you've been spending your time with. All of it. Not just the parts that make me easier to like." Paisley was quiet for a long moment, arms still crossed, working through everything all at once. The shock, the betrayal of not knowing, and underneath all of it, the strange, undeniable fact that Logan had never once treated her badly, had never lied about who he was becoming, even while hiding who he'd been. He'd manipulated the situation, but not her. Not really.
"I need time,"
she finally said.
"I need to think about all of this, about what it means that everything between us started because you were testing whether my kindness was real."
"Take whatever time you need," Logan said. "I'm not going anywhere. And Paisley, everything I told you about wanting to change what I'm building, wanting a different future for myself, that part was never a test. That part was always true." Paisley didn't respond to that. Not yet. She simply turned and walked out of the office, back toward the elevator, leaving Logan standing alone in the quiet room with a photograph of his own worst night still hanging on the wall outside. Proof of exactly how far one small act of kindness had traveled. Paisley flew back to Cedar Ridge the next morning without saying goodbye, and for 4 days, Logan didn't hear a single word from her. He didn't chase her. He'd learned enough about her by now to know that Paisley wasn't someone who could be rushed into forgiveness, and pushing too hard would only prove every doubt she now carried about him. So he waited, buried himself in work he'd been neglecting for weeks, and let the silence sit exactly where she'd left it. On the 5th day, she called him. "I've been thinking," she said, no greeting, straight into it, the way she always talked when something mattered. "About everything, the lie, the reasons behind it, what you actually did with that lie once it started. And you never once treated me like less than what I am," Paisley said slowly, like she was still working the thought out as she spoke it. "You lied about who you were, but you never lied about how you treated me. You showed up. You listened. You got dunked in cold water 11 times for a charity festival in a town you didn't grow up in." A pause. "I'm still angry. I don't know if that's going away anytime soon, but I don't think I can just walk away from this either." "I don't expect you to just get over it," Logan said. "I'd rather earn it back slowly than have you pretend it didn't happen." "Good," Paisley said, "because I'm not the kind of person who pretends." That conversation became the start of something neither of them had a clear name for yet. Not quite what they'd had before Chicago, but not broken either. Logan flew out to Cedar Ridge the following week, and instead of sitting across from her in his usual booth, he asked her a question he'd been turning over since the moment she'd walked out of his office. "I want to change what Harrow actually does,"
he said. "Not just the charitable arm buying up struggling diners here and there. I want to build the whole company around towns like this one. And I want someone who actually understands what small towns need running that side of it. Not a consultant from Chicago who's never lived anywhere with a population under 100,000. "You're offering me a job," Paisley said, half amused. "I'm offering you the job. Community relations, working directly with towns we're looking to invest in. You'd know what questions to ask that my people never would. You'd know the difference between help that actually helps and help that just looks good in a press release." Paisley thought about it for exactly as long as it took to glance around the newly renovated diner. The fresh paint, the new equipment Frank was still getting used to, the booth where she'd first handed a stranger her last $43. "I'm not leaving Cedar Ridge," she said. "This is still my home." "You wouldn't have to leave. The job's built around travel, not relocation. A few days here, a week there, then back home." She was quiet for a long moment. "And if I take this, and it turns out to just be another way of keeping me close because you feel guilty about the lie?" "Then fire yourself," Logan said simply. "You'd know within a month whether the work is real. I'm betting you will." She took the job. Over the following weeks, they traveled together to towns across the Midwest that Paisley had only ever heard of in passing. A struggling diner outside Kansas City on the verge of losing its lease. A family-owned hardware store in rural Missouri that had been undercut for years by a chain 3 towns over. A small bakery in Indiana run by a widow trying to keep her late husband's recipes alive without the money to fix a broken oven. In every town, Paisley did what she did best without even trying. She talked to people, actually listened to what they needed instead of what a spreadsheet said they should want, and made sure every deal Harrow put together protected the people already there, instead of erasing them for something newer and shinier. "You were right," Logan admitted one evening, sitting across from her in a rental car outside the Indiana bakery after a long day of negotiations that had gone better than his own team had projected. "I would have offered that woman a buyout and rebuilt the place from scratch. You talked to her for 20 minutes and figured out all she actually needed was a new oven and someone to fix her supplier contract." "People don't need saving most of the time," Paisley said, looking out the window at the bakery's flickering sign. "They need someone to actually ask what they're dealing with instead of assuming." Logan watched her for a moment, struck again by something he kept rediscovering about her every time he thought he'd already learned it fully. "You've changed how I think about running this whole company," he said. "Not just the charitable side of it, all of it." "How so?" "I used to measure success by how much control I had over an outcome, how much leverage, how much fear I could put behind a decision to make sure it went my way." He shook his head slowly. "You've never once tried to control anything. You just show up, pay attention, and let people tell you what they actually need. It works better than anything I built my career on." Paisley reached over and squeezed his hand, the first time she'd initiated something like that since Chicago. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think the man sitting next to me right now is a lot different from the businessman who walked into my diner a couple months ago. And I don't just mean the suit." "Good different or worried different?" "Good different," she said, smiling. "You still owe me for the trust issues you caused, though. Don't think that's forgotten." "I'll be paying that debt off for a long time," Logan said. "I'm all right with that." Behind them, Dominic's attempted takeover had already begun quietly falling apart, undone by the same inner circle loyalty Logan had spent years building before anyone had tried to take it from him. But that story belonged to Chicago, to boardrooms and leverage, and a world Logan was slowly, deliberately stepping away from. Out here, in small towns most people back home couldn't find on a map, he was building something that felt less like an empire and more like the kind of life he actually wanted. One town, one diner, one honest conversation at a time. The diner looked almost nothing like it had a year ago, and yet somehow, walking through the front door, it still felt exactly the same. The booths were the same faded red vinyl, patched in a few places rather than replaced entirely, because Paisley had insisted the character of the place mattered more than making it look brand new. The kitchen behind the counter hummed with equipment that actually worked now. No more duct tape holding the old fryer together. No more Frank crossing his fingers every time he turned on the grill. Outside, a small plaque near the door read, "Cedar Ridge Diner, serving this town since before most of us were born," and underneath it, a newer line had been added. "Rebuilt by the people who love it." Word had gotten out, slowly, about who had really saved the place.
Not through any announcement Logan made, but through the natural way small towns eventually figure everything out. Frank had put it together first, noticing how often the quiet businessmen from Chicago showed up, how close he'd grown to Paisley, how the timing of the sale lined up a little too neatly with when the two of them had first started talking. He never said anything about it to anyone outside his own kitchen. Some things, Frank figured, weren't his to tell. The diner had become something of a destination now, written up in a regional magazine as one of the best-preserved small-town restaurants in the state, busy most mornings with both long-time regulars and travelers who'd read about it online. But Paisley still worked the breakfast shift most days, still knew every regular's order, still snuck extra pancakes onto a kid's plate when their parents weren't looking. Logan found her there on a quiet Tuesday morning, the diner between rushes, sunlight cutting long across the floor through the front windows. "I need to tell you something," he said, sliding into his old booth, the same one he'd sat in the very first week he'd come back disguised as a stranger with a clean shave and a different name. "Something I never told you. About that day." Paisley set down the coffee pot and sat across from him, sensing the shift in his voice. "Go on." "That $43 you gave me," Logan said. "I've thought about telling you this a dozen times, and I don't know why I kept waiting." He paused, gathering the words carefully, like he wanted to get this exactly right. "It wasn't just enough for a bus ticket and a meal. It was the only money I had in the world that morning. Every account I owned, every card in my wallet, all of it had been frozen or stolen the night before, by the same men who tried to have me finished." "I know that part," Paisley said gently. "You told me, back in Chicago." "There's more to it." Logan leaned forward. "I never actually made it to that bus stop on my own. I collapsed about half a mile down the road, further out than I let on. If I hadn't had that money in my pocket, I would have kept walking toward the highway with nothing. And I don't know if I would have made it before whoever was watching for me finally caught up." He held her gaze. "Marcus's team found me because of the emergency signal, yes, but they found me at that bus stop specifically, because that's exactly where I was heading with the ticket you helped me buy. If you hadn't given me that money, I would have been somewhere else entirely when they finally located me. Somewhere they might not have reached in time." Paisley sat back, absorbing the weight of what he was telling her, something she hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. "You're saying that $43 didn't just buy you breakfast and a bus ticket?" "It probably saved my life," Logan said simply. "Everything that came after, the company, the towns we've helped since, all of it. None of that exists without that decision you made in about 10 seconds, giving away money you needed for your own bills to a stranger who looked like exactly the kind of person you should have been afraid of." Paisley was quiet for a long moment, looking around the diner that had once nearly closed forever, thinking about how close everything had come to unraveling in ways neither of them had fully understood at the time. "I didn't think about any of that," she finally said. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I had a little bit to give." "I know," Logan said. "That's exactly what makes it matter." Frank called out from the kitchen that the morning order was ready, and Paisley got up automatically, years of habit pulling her toward the counter, even in the middle of a conversation like this one. But before she walked away, she paused, looking back at Logan with something soft and certain in her expression. "You know," she said, "when I think about that morning now, I don't think about the money at all. I think about the fact that you said thank you to people who just told you to leave, that you didn't get angry, didn't argue, just accepted it and moved on with more grace than most people show when things actually go their way." She shook her head slowly.
That's the part that made me stop you at the door. Not pity, just you seemed like someone worth believing in, even without a reason to.
I'm glad you believed in the wrong reason, Logan said, smiling. Turns out, it was the right one. Later that evening, after the diner had closed for the night and Frank had gone home, Logan and Paisley sat together on the front steps, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the mountains that surrounded Cedar Ridge. The town was quiet, in the particular way small towns get quiet at dusk, streetlights flickering on one by one, a dog barking somewhere a few streets over.
Frank wants to retire in a couple years, Paisley said. Says he wants to hand the place fully over to someone who actually loves it the way he did when he was young enough to run it himself.
Any idea who that might be? Logan asked, though he already suspected the answer.
I've got a few ideas, Paisley said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Whoever it ends up being, I think this place is finally exactly what it's supposed to be.
Neither of them said much else after that. They didn't need to. What had started with a stranger walking through a door nobody wanted him to walk through, and a waitress who decided to trust him anyway, had grown into something neither of them could have predicted that first cold morning. A friendship built without pretense, a partnership built on honesty once the truth finally surfaced, and a life neither of them would trade for anything, built one small act of kindness at a time. The diner's lights stayed on a little longer than usual that night, and somewhere down Route 9, the same road where it had all begun, the bus still ran twice a day, carrying strangers toward wherever they were headed, none of them knowing what a single act of trust could turn into if it landed in the right hands.